the last voice of the old Navy. In the final years of the Second World War, as the United States edged closer to victory, and as science reshaped the very meaning of warfare, one man stood at the center of American decision-making more firmly than any general, scientist, or politician except the president himself. Fleet Admiral William Daniel Leahy, the first officer in American history to hold the 5-star rank, former chief of naval operations, former ambassador to France, former governor of Puerto Rico, and Roosevelt's closest military advisor, became the final representative of an older military world that was about to be overtaken by the atomic age. Leahy's influence inside the Roosevelt and Truman administrations was immense. Unlike Army Chief of Staff George Marshall or Admiral Ernest King, whose roles were defined by their services, Leahy occupied a unique position, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief. This role made him the coordinator of all U.S. military branches and the senior-most military advisor to the President. Roosevelt trusted him deeply, meeting with him daily, often privately, and depending on his judgment in virtually every major strategic decision. When Harry Truman assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, he inherited not only a global conflict, but also the advisory structure Roosevelt had built, and at the top of that structure stood Leahy. But with Truman in the White House, Leahy's influence, though still enormous, began to collide with the most consequential scientific and military development of the century, the Manhattan Project. Unlike many high-ranking officers, Leahy had been brought into the atomic program relatively late, learning its details only during the final year of the war. He came from a generation of naval leadership shaped by World War I battleships and interwar diplomacy, not theoretical physics or strategic bombing doctrines. The idea of a single device capable of destroying an entire city was alien to his strategic worldview, and he immediately approached it with skepticism. This skepticism was not political, it was professional. Leahy had spent his life studying real battlefields, naval engagements, logistics, amphibious warfare, intelligence, blockade strategy. He believed wars were won through sustained operations, industrial endurance, and naval dominance. To him, the notion of a war-ending superweapon seemed more like speculative science than real strategy. Moreover, he worried that reliance on such a weapon would distort military thinking, replacing sound planning with dangerous temptation. Within the Roosevelt administration, dissenting views about the bomb were tolerated because the project was still theoretical. Within the Truman administration, however, the bomb was approaching operational readiness, and decisions about its use were becoming urgent. As the new president was briefed on the Manhattan Project, he leaned heavily on Leahy, who was the only senior advisor in the room with decades of experience in global command. Yet Leahy's guidance, grounded in traditional military logic, increasingly clashed with the momentum driving the atomic program forward. Leahy's caution was reinforced by the intelligence assessments he saw daily. By mid-1945, the U.S. Navy had strangled Japan's maritime supply lines, destroyed much of its merchant fleet, and left its economy near collapse. The blockade was working. Leahy believed Japan was already strategically defeated, regardless of the ferocious resistance on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. He repeatedly argued that Japan could be forced into surrender to continued blockade, conventional bombing, and diplomatic pressure, especially by bringing the Soviet Union into the war, without resorting to a weapon whose consequences no one fully understood. Inside the Truman administration, this position set Leahy apart. Most military planners, particularly within the Army Air Forces, believed the bomb was essential to ending the war quickly and avoiding a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands. Many of the Manhattan Project scientific leadership believed its use was inevitable, even necessary for demonstrating American power in the post-war world. Truman's political advisors emphasized the moral responsibility to end the war swiftly and save American lives. Leahy, however, adhered to a simple principle. Weapons of unprecedented destructive power should not be used unless absolutely unavoidable, and he believed the atomic bomb did not meet that standard. What made Leahy's position so remarkable was not just his rank, but his conviction. He argued that the bomb was barbarous, that Japan was already defeated, and that using such a weapon would stain the reputation of the United States. He voiced these concerns directly to Truman in private meetings, something very few military officers ever dared. His opposition was not ideological, but moral and strategic, shaped by a lifetime in uniform, and a worldview forged long before nuclear physics altered the trajectory of war. Yet despite Leahy's authority, the inner circle of atomic decision-making began to shift away from him. Truman, increasingly influenced by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, General George Marshall, and scientific advisors, found Leahy's skepticism overly conservative. The Manhattan Project's momentum, built over years in secrecy and at unprecedented expense, made opposition difficult to sustain. Within the military establishment, the view was growing that the atomic bomb represented not only a path to victory, but a symbol of American scientific and industrial supremacy. As the summer of 1945 progressed, Leahy watched the strategic debate move past him. He had not lost Truman's respect, far from it, but he no longer shaped the direction of the bomb's development and deployment. When the first test at Alamogordo succeeded on July 16th, the news confirmed the bomb's operational inevitability. Leahy privately hoped that demonstration or negotiation might precede combat use, but the planning machinery was already set in motion. On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Leahy later wrote that he had believed, until the end, that the weapon was unnecessary and that Japan was prepared to surrender without it. In his memoirs, he expressed sadness, not at Japan's defeat, but at what he felt the United States had compromised in achieving it. History books often downplay his dissent, but his writings remain one of the clearest and highest-level objections to the use of nuclear weapons in 1945. Leahy's warnings did not prevent the atomic age, but they reveal a forgotten chapter of U.S. military leadership, a moment when the most senior officer in America believed the bomb would reshape not just warfare, but the moral foundation of the nation itself. Inside Truman's war room, Leahy versus the atomic momentum. When Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency on April 12, 1945, he entered office with no transition, no preparation, and almost no knowledge of the most secret military project ever undertaken. Franklin Roosevelt had kept the Manhattan Project tightly compartmentalized. Even the vice president had been excluded. Suddenly, in the midst of global war, Truman found himself confronted not only with the challenge of defeating Japan, but with the existence of a weapon so powerful that it threatened to redefine the moral and strategic foundations of warfare. Into this void stepped the one man Truman could immediately rely on, Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, the senior-most officer in the United States Armed Forces, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the only advisor who had been at Roosevelt's side for every major wartime decision. Leahy's immense institutional memory and calm, systematic approach made him indispensable to a president who barely had time to catch his breath before being pulled into questions of global strategy. Yet the very qualities that made Leahy valuable also placed him in direct opposition to the accelerating momentum behind the atomic bomb. Truman's first major introduction to the bomb came 2 weeks after he took office, during a formal briefing arranged by Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The presentation included the basic scientific principles, projected destructive power, and anticipated strategic implications. Leahy attended these early meetings, listening carefully but without enthusiasm. He understood that the bomb existed. He understood that it represented a new class of weapon, but he did not believe it would be decisive. His military worldview, shaped over more than half a century, emphasized naval blockade, industrial attrition, and coordinated amphibious operations, factors that had already brought Japan to the brink of collapse. To Leahy, the atomic bomb was an unknown variable inserted into a situation already moving toward resolution. In his assessments to Truman, he emphasized intelligence, indicating Japan's internal exhaustion. The Navy had been shattered, its merchant fleet destroyed, and its access to critical materials eliminated by U.S. submarines. Strategic bombing had devastated dozens of Japanese cities, and civilian morale was approaching total collapse. Leahy argued that any invasion of the home islands would be costly, but Japan's long-term capacity to resist was effectively gone. In other words, victory was already certain. The only question was timing. Meanwhile, within other parts of the U.S. government, a different assessment was taking hold. General Leslie Groves, military head of the Manhattan Project, and many of the project's senior scientists believed the bomb offered a path to immediate and overwhelming victory. Army Air Forces leadership, especially General Henry Hap Arnold, saw it as a culmination of the air power doctrine that had guided their development since the interwar years. Diplomatic strategists viewed it as a tool that would shape negotiations with the Soviet Union after the war. The growing consensus was that the bomb was not merely a weapon. It was a geopolitical instrument. Leahy saw these arguments but remained unconvinced. He told Truman in several internal discussions that relying on the bomb violated the ethical standards of civilized nations. In his memoir, he later wrote that he believed Japan was already defeated and ready to surrender, and that using atomic weapons would not be militarily necessary. Although he expressed these views privately at the time, the documentary record confirms that he consistently urged caution. His perspective, however, increasingly clashed with the bureaucratic and scientific enthusiasm building around the project. The Potsdam Conference in July 1945 intensified these debates. Truman traveled to Germany accompanied by key advisors, including Leahy, Stimson, and General George Marshall. During breaks in the negotiations, the American delegation received updates on the Manhattan Project's progress. On July 16th, during the conference, the Trinity test succeeded in New Mexico. The explosion confirmed beyond any remaining doubt that the United States possessed a functioning atomic weapon. Stimson and Marshall were elated. Truman, who had struggled with uncertainty, now felt he possessed a decisive tool that could end the war on American terms. Leahy's reaction was strikingly different. He acknowledged the scientific achievement, but he immediately began questioning the strategic necessity of using the weapon. At Potsdam, discussions began about issuing a final ultimatum to Japan. The resulting document, the Potsdam Declaration, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender or prompt and utter destruction. Leahy participated in drafting discussions, but continued to emphasize that Japan's capacity to continue the war was collapsing. He believed the next steps should focus on diplomacy and intensifying the blockade. This position, however, increasingly placed Leahy at odds not only with the nuclear scientists and political advisors, but with the Army. General Marshall took a more nuanced stance than some later narratives suggest. He did not advocate for atomic bombing as the only solution, but he did believe the bomb could drastically shorten the war. Leahy, by contrast, saw it as overkill, an unnecessary acceleration toward destruction. A key point of divergence concerned Japan's internal political dynamics. Leahy believed that Japan's leadership, especially through back-channel negotiations involving the Soviet Union, was actively searching for a way to surrender without complete national humiliation. He understood that Japanese political structures were rigid but not unbreakable, and he believed that offering assurances about the emperor's status could bring an end to the war. Others in the administration, particularly within the military, argued that Japan had shown no clear willingness to surrender, and that the U.S. should assume resistance would continue until crushed. This disagreement foreshadowed the most consequential divide: whether Truman should authorize the atomic bomb for use on populated cities. By mid-July, operational planning was already underway. The Army Air Forces had prepared bomber groups trained specifically for nuclear delivery. Target committees had selected cities based on industrial, military, and psychological criteria. Everything, from bomb casing assembly to delivery schedules, was organized under extreme secrecy. Even Truman, often portrayed as holding absolute authority, was now riding the momentum of a project whose implementation had been meticulously prepared over years. Leahy continued to advise restraint. He believed that modern warfare already inflicted unprecedented civilian casualties through firebombing, and that introducing a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities in seconds crossed a moral line. His opposition was also grounded in concerns about post-war precedent. He foresaw that if nuclear weapons became normalized, future wars would escalate beyond control. He predicted an arms race, a prediction that history proved correct. Yet Leahy's influence was waning. Truman respected him deeply, but as the president grew more confident and as the atomic planning apparatus solidified, Leahy found himself increasingly sidelined in decisions concerning the bomb. Truman sought his advice, listened, and occasionally agreed with his sentiment, but he did not act on it. The moral weight of Leahy's position could not withstand the bureaucratic inertia, scientific enthusiasm, and military urgency driving the project forward. When Truman finally authorized the use of the atomic bomb in late July, the order bypassed much of the Joint Chiefs' deliberative structure. The directive flowed through the War Department and the Army Air Forces, not through Leahy's office. Although he was still the most senior military advisor in the nation, the decision did not require his approval. On August 6, 1945, the bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Leahy was horrified. In his later writings, he articulated his position without ambiguity. He believed the bomb had been used unnecessarily and that, in doing so, the United States had violated its own ethical standards. He wrote, "I was not taught to make war in that fashion." In the immediate aftermath, he did not openly challenge Truman. The principle of civilian control was absolute in his mind. But internally, he made clear that he believed the bomb's use had set a precedent the world might not recover from. More importantly, he believed that his warnings, grounded in experience, ethics, and strategic caution, had been drowned out by a machine he could no longer influence. Yet the story did not end there. The decision to use the bomb unleashed the geopolitical structure of the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and the militarization of atomic science. And in the years that followed, Leahy's opposition would become one of the earliest, clearest, and most authoritative critiques of nuclear warfare from within the highest levels of the U.S. military. The Admiral after Hiroshima, Isolation, Accuracy, and the First Warnings of a Nuclear Age. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the world changed instantly. But inside the American government, the immediate reaction among senior leaders varied sharply. Many celebrated the end of the war. Many saw the bomb as a triumph of American science and industrial power. Others saw it as the unavoidable price of avoiding a bloody invasion. A few, mostly within the Navy, regarded it with unease. But no senior figure responded with more moral conviction or more strategic clarity than Admiral William D. Leahy. As the President's Chief of Staff and the highest-ranking officer in the United States, Leahy had been present at every key meeting in the run-up to the bomb's deployment. His opposition, though voiced privately during the war, became unmistakable in the immediate aftermath. The documents, memos, and later his own published memoirs make his stance clear. He believed the atomic bomb had been used unnecessarily, and he warned that it would change the nature of war in ways the world was not prepared for. But this opposition came at a cost. In the months following the war, Leahy found himself increasingly isolated. Truman respected him deeply. He would later call Leahy one of the most important advisors he ever had. But the strategic direction of post-war America was shifting away from the worldview Leahy represented. The atomic age demanded scientists, theorists, and new forms of defense planning that the U.S. military had never confronted. Leahy, a product of an older era of battleship diplomacy and conventional warfare, now stood almost alone as the highest-level critic of the new weapon the United States had unleashed. The first sign of this shift emerged during the initial post-war discussions about the future of atomic weapons. Throughout late 1945 and early 1946, Truman's administration began debating the creation of civilian oversight structures for nuclear research and development. The question was not simply who would control the bomb, but who would define the philosophy behind its existence. The Army Air Forces, under General Carl Spaatz and General Hap Arnold, saw the atomic bomb as central to the future of U.S. air strategy. The Navy, whose traditional dominance had been built on carrier aviation and capital ships, faced an existential threat. A single bomb could sink what had taken decades to build. Leahy understood better than almost anyone that the atomic bomb undermined the foundational logic of naval strategy. Battleships, blockades, attrition warfare. None of it mattered if a weapon could destroy entire fleets in a single strike. This was not merely competition between services. It was a complete collapse of the world he had trained to master. Yet Leahy's objections were not self-interested. He recognized that nuclear weapons threatened not only naval dominance, but all conventional military reasoning. He believed the bomb's destructive capacity exceeded any rational limit of warfare. In his post-war memoir, I Was There, published in 1950, he wrote that using the atomic bomb meant the United States had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. These words were harsh, but they were consistent with everything he had been saying privately since 1945. Leahy's belief that Japan was already defeated before Hiroshima was not a retrospective invention. It was grounded in intelligence reports that crossed his desk in spring and summer 1945. The U.S. Navy's blockade had rendered Japan economically immobile. Oil imports had fallen to almost zero. The Japanese merchant marine had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war capacity. Famine pressures were increasing. American submarine operations had severed internal shipping routes. Leahy, who had spent decades studying maritime strategy, believed these factors made Japan's defeat inevitable. What Leahy did not fully anticipate was how the political environment of post-war America would shift toward the very thing he feared: permanent nuclear readiness. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, discussions began about retaining a nuclear monopoly. The military establishment, especially the Army Air Forces, saw the bomb as essential for deterring Soviet expansion. Scientific leaders debated how quickly the Soviet Union could develop its own nuclear technology. Strategists like Bernard Brodie and other early nuclear theorists began articulating concepts of deterrence that would dominate military thought for decades. Leahy, now in his late 60s, watched as the U.S. government pivoted away from the conventional strategies he had dedicated his life to mastering. He believed that the nuclear arms race, though not yet named, was already forming. In internal meetings, he argued that the United States should push for international control of atomic energy rather than militarization. He supported the early versions of the Acheson-Lilienthal report, which proposed placing nuclear materials under an international authority. But by 1946, Soviet relations had deteriorated to the point where genuine cooperation became impossible. Meanwhile, the military bureaucracy that had built the Manhattan Project evolved into the earliest version of the Cold War defense state. The Joint Chiefs of Staff increasingly focused on strategic air power. The Navy fought bitter internal battles to preserve relevance. The newly created Atomic Energy Commission took control of nuclear research. Truman began relying more heavily on advisors like Secretary of State James Burns and later George Kennan, whose worldview aligned more closely with deterrence than with Leahy's warnings. Leahy's influence began to wane, not because Truman stopped respecting him, but because the world had moved in a direction that left little room for his views. The Admiral was a defender of traditional military ethics, an advocate of negotiated surrender, and a skeptic of revolutionary weapons. The post-war United States, however, was moving toward a national security doctrine built around the very weapon Leahy opposed. His principled stance became a historical footnote rather than a guiding principle. In 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act, restructuring the entire U.S. defense establishment. The U.S. Air Force became an independent branch. The National Security Council was created. The Department of Defense consolidated military leadership under a new civilian secretary. These changes further entrenched air power and nuclear strategy as the heart of American military doctrine. Leahy remained in his position until 1949, advising Truman through the early Cold War crises, including the Berlin blockade. But his role was more symbolic than directive. The atomic bomb had permanently altered the balance of strategic thinking, and the old naval worldview could not compete with the political, military, and scientific forces converging around nuclear policy. The Soviet Union's first nuclear test in 1949 confirmed Leahy's fears. The American monopoly was broken. A global arms race had begun. Many officials reacted with shock, but Leahy did not. He had warned that the bomb's use would transform global politics and accelerate military competition. Now, the United States faced a world where nuclear destruction was no longer a hypothetical threat, but a shared capability. Leahy's final years in government reflected a man who had seen the world shift under his feet. He continued advising Truman until illness forced his retirement. His memoir, published the year he left office, served as both a historical account and a quiet critique of the direction the United States had taken. He never condemned Truman personally, nor did he oppose civilian control of the military. But he remained unwavering in his belief that atomic warfare represented a dangerous moral and strategic departure. History later buried Leahy's objections under narratives of victory, scientific triumph, and Cold War necessity. Yet his warnings proved prophetic. The concerns he voiced about civilian casualties, ethical boundaries, and the long-term consequences of nuclear escalation became central themes of later international debates. Scholars studying the origins of nuclear strategy often rediscovered Leahy's writings and realized that one of the earliest and most senior critics of nuclear weapons had been the president's own top military advisor. But in 1945 and 1946, his voice was overshadowed. Not silenced by force, but by momentum, by the rapid reorientation of American power toward a future he believed would be more dangerous, less stable, and morally ambiguous. The legacy Washington buried. How Leahy became the first forgotten critic of nuclear warfare. In the decade after the Second World War, as the United States reshaped its national security institutions and settled into the early architecture of the Cold War, Admiral William D. Leahy gradually faded from the center of strategic debate. He did not disappear immediately. He remained physically present in Washington, advising Truman through the Berlin crisis, the Marshall Plan's launch, the formation of NATO, and the first years of U.S. nuclear policy. Yet the intellectual world transforming around him made him an increasingly marginal figure, someone respected for past service, but whose worldview no longer aligned with the emerging reality of the atomic age. This fading was not deliberate suppression. Rather, it reflected the rapid institutional and cultural shift taking place inside the U.S. government. The armed forces reorganized. The State Department reshaped its diplomatic philosophy toward containment. Think tanks and academic institutions emerged as new centers of strategic thought. The nuclear threat demanded statistical modeling, new command doctrines, and a new generation of scientific advisors. Leahy, with his half-century of experience in conventional warfare, belonged to a world that policymakers believed the atomic bomb had rendered obsolete. But the fading of Leahy's influence had deeper causes, structural, political, and cultural, that together formed the first act of nuclear-era forgetting. One major cause was the rise of strategic air power. After 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces reorganized into the independent U.S. Air Force, and with this reorganization came an entire worldview centered on long-range nuclear strike capability. Figures like Curtis LeMay, who shaped Strategic Air Command, viewed the atomic bomb not as a last resort, but as the core of a new form of warfare. The nuclear-armed bomber became the defining symbol of American power. In this framework, Leahy's philosophy, centered on blockades, combined operations, and the preservation of ethical limits, was simply incompatible. Air power theorists did not see the bomb as an ethical rupture, but as the logical extension of technological evolution. Their language was mathematical. Megatons, yield, delivery range, circular error probable. Leahy's language was moral and strategic, necessity, proportionality, inevitability of defeat. By 1947, the two worldviews barely intersected. Another factor was the restructuring of the U.S. defense establishment under the National Security Act of 1947. This legislation created a system built for perpetual preparedness, unified doctrine, and streamlined decision-making. It centralized intelligence, created the National Military Establishment, later the Department of Defense, and institutionalized the Joint Chiefs. Although Leahy had chaired the JCS during the war, the post-war JCS had a different function. It was now part of a permanent apparatus built to manage a long-term global confrontation. In this new structure, the senior military advisor to the president was not a coordinating figure like Leahy, but a representative of one service among several. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs would later become the closest analogy to Leahy's wartime role, but that position did not exist until 1949. Leahy's wartime title, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, was abolished. The system he had personified no longer existed. A third factor was a rapid onset of the U.S. Soviet confrontation. As early as 1946, George Kennan's long telegram and the ensuing doctrine of containment pushed American strategy toward managing a global ideological conflict. This conflict made nuclear weapons central to deterrence. Leahy's vision, that atomic weapons should be treated as fundamentally different, morally constrained, and ideally eliminated through international agreement, did not fit the emerging strategic narrative. By the time the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, Leahy's warnings seemed, to many in Washington, like relics of a more innocent era. The nuclear monopoly was over. The United States was no longer deciding whether to build a nuclear world. It was reacting to one that now existed on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The logic of arms racing emerged immediately. Within months, discussions turned to thermonuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb. This development cut even further against Leahy's moral and strategic convictions. The hydrogen bomb promised destruction orders of magnitude greater than Hiroshima, making the atomic bomb appear small by comparison. Scientists were divided. Some, like J. Robert Oppenheimer, argued that developing the hydrogen bomb would fundamentally alter humanity's relationship with war. Others insisted it was necessary for deterrence. The military leadership largely supported it. Leahy opposed it. He believed such weapons served no legitimate military purpose. But by 1949, his authority had waned so much that his objections carried little weight. The decision to pursue the hydrogen bomb was made in 1950, months before Leahy left office. Despite his near-complete loss of influence over nuclear strategy, Leahy remained Truman's trusted advisor in other matters up until the end of his service. He continued coordinating cabinet meetings, advising on foreign policy, and participating in major wartime legacy decisions. Truman valued him deeply, not as a nuclear strategist, but as the man who had provided stability during Roosevelt's final years and Truman's chaotic early months. In that sense, Leahy remained one of the last personal bridges connecting the pre-atomic world to the nuclear one. But outside the Oval Office, Leahy's public profile declined. New generations of military leaders became national figures. New crises, Berlin, Korea, the Marshall Plan, reshaped public debate. Historians and journalists in the late 1940s and early 1950s focused on the triumphant narrative of victory in the Pacific, the scientific brilliance of the Manhattan Project, and the geopolitical logic of deterrence. Leahy's opposition did not fit comfortably into any of these stories. His memoir, I Was There, published in 1950, offered one of the earliest critiques of nuclear warfare from a senior U.S. official. But the book appeared at a moment when the country was entering the Korean War and anxieties about Soviet expansion overshadowed ethical debates about the atomic bomb. Leahy's warnings were noticed but not widely discussed. The reviews were respectful but muted. The book gradually slipped into the background. After his retirement in 1949, Leahy's health declined. He died in 1959 at age 84. By then, America had tested hydrogen bombs, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, and the nuclear arms race had become the defining feature of global politics. Few remembered that the highest-ranking officer in U.S. history had passionately opposed the use of the atomic bomb. Fewer still understood the depth of his moral and strategic objections. Yet historians revisiting the early atomic era have increasingly recognized Leahy's importance. His writings and wartime notes offer a rare window into the internal dissent at the highest levels of the U.S. government. They reveal that the birth of the atomic age was not met with universal acceptance, but with deep concern from at least one man who understood the cost of war better than most. Leahy's legacy endures not because he shaped nuclear policy, he did not, but because he represents the last moment when the highest levels of American military leadership attempted to draw a clear moral boundary around warfare. His warnings anticipated nearly every major nuclear dilemma that followed: civilian vulnerability, arms racing, escalation risk, the breakdown of ethical norms, and the temptation to rely on technology rather than strategy. In that sense, Leahy became the first suppressed voice of the nuclear age, not intentionally silenced, but overshadowed by a world moving too quickly to heed him. His forgotten dissent stands today as a reminder that the arrival of nuclear weapons was not a universally celebrated milestone. It was, for at least one man at the very top of the American government, a tragic turning point. The atomic age was born with applause, fear, celebration, and calculation, but also with a warning. A warning from the most senior military officer in American history, a man who believed that victory achieved without restraint was not victory at all. That warning, largely ignored at the time, remains one of the most significant and most overlooked voices in the history of a nuclear era.